Well, last night, the data for the 5th of May 2017 was online. And when I started doing my presentations around sustainability and sustainability finance in about 2007, we were at about 380 parts per million in the atmosphere. On Friday afternoon, we went through 410. And for anyone who was doing sustainability thinking or investing or anything in that space in the early 90s, you'll remember that around Rio we spoke about 350 then as being the kind of like ceiling that we should go through, and you'll know some of the stories around 350.org, etc. But it was for me quite a sobering moment to see 410 printed on the screen. I went back on this morning and refreshed my view, and the data for the 8th of May, which was obviously yesterday, the day before yesterday, Monday, was at 409.
Economic and political system which at the moment is very much geared to keeping the momentum behind burning of fossil fuels as much as possible. Fossil fuel companies as institutions nod now to the problem of climate change, but in practice they are still digging in their heels enormously to protect their own interests. So in the 2015, the Union of Concerned Scientists in the US looked at how 8 leading fossil fuel companies are dealing with global warming. Found that none has made a clean break from disinformation on climate science and from trying to obstruct policies to reduce emissions. At the moment, that's a transformation that very few of them show any signs of addressing in a concerted way. ExxonMobil, for example, ostensibly supports a carbon tax, but really at emissions that would have little effect at levels that would have little effect on emissions. And as recently as 2015, it's spent nearly $2 million on think tanks and advocacy groups that continue to cast doubt on the science of climate change. So this is a corporation that is still standing squarely in the path of the kind of action that we need. ExxonMobil and companies like Shell and BP have actually known about the science of climate change for decades. Their internal records and show that the science was very clearly understood by them decades ago. And in the United States, for example, a case has been brought by the New York Attorney General against ExxonMobil for concealing this evidence. That case remains to be seen.
I tend to talk about this on a global scale and talk about Trump and the damage that he's doing. But this Trump effect is very much present in South Africa, not just at a government level, but also in the financial industry. So the government has something called and I actually have to read it out, Coal Baseload Independent Power Producer Procurement Program, or the CBI-PPPP. And the original plan behind that was to commission up to 11 privately owned, brand new coal-fired power stations in South Africa over the next 20 years. The Department of Energy selected a company called Thabametsi to be one of the first 2 preferred bidders in the first bidding round. And the Department of Environmental Affairs gave Thabametsi its environmental authorization, which is basically its legal permission to build from an environmental perspective, on the basis of an environmental impact assessment that said that this power station will have no effect on climate change. So we... EarthLife Africa, which is an NGO that many of you are probably much more familiar with now than you were a few weeks ago after the nuclear judgment. We represented EarthLife Africa in challenging the granting of the environmental authorization. So we appealed the granting of the environmental authorization to the Department of Environmental Affairs and said you can't possibly authorize a new coal-fired power station in South Africa without considering the climate change implications. And the Minister of Environmental Affairs dismissed our appeal and said that there's no legal basis in South Africa to require a climate change impact assessment for new coal. The Minister of Environmental Affairs. So what she did do, though, in a very strange move that we still don't understand, was she simultaneously directed Thabametsi to conduct a climate change impact assessment. So in the interim, we took her decision on review to the High Court, and on the 8th of March this year, the North Gauteng High Court found that, of course, you couldn't give an environmental authorization to a coal-fired power station without considering its climate change impacts. and that our existing environmental law, which in the context of environmental impact assessments basically says that you must take into account any significant environmental impact from a particular project. And the court held that self-evidently that must include a climate change impact assessment. So the court overturned the minister's decision and sent the appeal back to her office to be redecided on the basis of the findings of what Thabametsi has now conducted, a proper climate change impact assessment, grumbling about the fact that it cost them over R1 million to commission. And what that impact says, what that impact assessment says, sorry, let me just find the proper words because it's important. So the findings of their own environmental consultants on the climate change implications of this power station are that the impacts of climate change, particularly on water availability, water quality, and temperature increases, are likely to pose a high risk to the power station in the short to long-term future. The magnitude of the power plant's emissions is very large. The plant does not represent an improvement on the emissions intensity of South Africa's grid, and that the drought conditions, which have historically impacted on this community where the power station will be built, are likely to worsen and to be worsened by the presence of a power station which will draw significantly on the local water resources. So, importantly, what the judge said was that the fact, I mean, he didn't say it the way I'm going to say it, but this is what he meant. He said that neither the Department of Energy's determination calling for new coal-fired power, nor the integrated resource plan for electricity, which factors in all these new coal-fired power stations, trumps environmental legislation. Sorry about the word, he did say trump. So what he means is the fact that our government operates on the basis that their Paris commitments somehow exist in a parallel universe to their policy decisions is no longer good enough. That these two things now have to intersect. And that we now have, it's a bit silly really, that we had to have a judge saying that coal-fired power stations are significant contributors to climate change, and that climate change poses a substantial risk to sustainable development in South Africa. So there are a bunch of implications of this from a investment point of view. And the point here is that, we're here today to talk about divestment, but in South Africa, our biggest banks are still investing in new coal. So the four biggest funders of this new power station are Standard Bank, Nedbank, Absa, and RMB. And each of those banks has very strong statements about its position to try and tackle climate change in its public domain. And yet they're investing in new coal-fired power stations and apparently investing in them without asking a single question about the impacts of those power stations on our future ability to mitigate and to adapt to the challenges of climate change. So those banks obviously have shareholders. Shareholders who are also not asking questions about why these banks are funding these projects. We have written to all of these banks raising these questions, and we're hoping they're going to engage with us on this. But Thabametsi is only one of 11 planned new privately owned power stations. And what this judgment has done is it's kind of wrought havoc with the procedure that Thabametsi has to go through to get final approval. Because one of the conditions of final approval from the government is that it has all of its legal authorizations in place for commencement. So we have disrupted that process now and delayed that, hopefully. But inevitably, the Minister of Environmental Affairs will give them their environmental authorization. She will find that the climate change impacts can be mitigated sufficiently, that they don't need to stop the project altogether, and so we will have to challenge that too. But we're also challenging all the other environmental authorizations that have been given to all these new projects. And so from a purely practical point of view, we hope that this judgment is going to make it a lot more difficult to invest in these projects because we and many others like us in the country are going to do our utmost to delay them, if not stop them altogether. The judge also very interestingly said that it's not illegitimate for EarthLife Africa to try to derail the building of new coal in South Africa. which is a significant statement from a judge who are, normally very conservative. He gave explicit support to the work of civil society to try to stop us from investing in new coal. So, yeah, there's this huge disconnect between words and actions. We all know this about our government, but we don't speak about it very often in the private sector. But it's just as prevalent and just as damaging, because it's all very well speaking out in public about your commitment to tackling climate change. But if you are funding new coal-fired power stations, you really are doing exactly what Trump is doing to the world as a whole on a local level. Thanks.
Thanks, Tracy.